It's Monday, and that's what happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Jeff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure that you can catch each Wednesday morning at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. While we're on this kind of television kick, let's get back into the War of the Worlds TV series from 1988 proper. Previously, I covered the 2-episode premiere pilot called The Resurrection, and in that movie-length first episode, captured Mortaxans from the 1953 movie had been kept at a base in containment barrels, and they eventually got free and began a new invasion by way of inhabiting the bodies of humans until those bodies decompose and become basically useless to the aliens. Now, the aliens plan to take back 3 Mortaxan ships that were stored at a hangar after their defeat in 1953 and want to do some pretty bad stuff as well as signal to their home world that the invasion is back on. But they are foiled by our human heroes who planted bombs on the ships to destroy them. However, things are only beginning and the Mortaxans have not yet given up their fight. Now, I'm pretty sure I mentioned this in the previous episode I did some months ago on that first episode, but in the 1953 film War of the Worlds, it was explicitly stated that the aliens came from Mars. However, as the decades essentially passed and it became less and less likely that Mars could support life that could even fly to Earth on more sophisticated technology than we possessed and try to conquer a larger world, it just didn't really quite work out. So to fix this and make it more plausible, the producers of the show decided to say that these were not Martians but Mortaxans. And I guess they're politically on the far left because they would like to tax the rich more. Anyway, Mortax is a planet 40 light years away in the Taurus constellation, and they orbit a dying sun. So, how's about that for some updating that makes sense and makes our story a little bit more believable? So, yes, we are going to go into the third episode named The Walls of Jericho. Now, I'm calling this the third episode as The Resurrection was actually shown in its full 2-hour format when the show began, but since it was always broken up into episode 1 and episode 2, part 1, part 2. Which, if you've seen that episode, you know that there is a definite difference that feels like there really are 2 episodes kind of smushed together. But anyway, each of these first season episodes are typically given titles that are biblical sounding. The Resurrection, The Walls of Jericho. Later on, there's an episode called Thy Kingdom Come, and so on. But this, I think, was all to basically make the show sound a little more epic in tone, despite there being a lot of dark comedy that plays throughout this first season. Now, one of the things that the show got some flack for was how it kind of consistently pushed the envelope for television standards. It was kind of gross and full of frights and gore and really dark concepts. And I know this was one of those shows like Friday the 13th, the series, and Freddy's Nightmares that probably got a lot of parents mad at TV people for putting these syndicated shows on the air. Either way, it shows this is kind of one of those shows that I do wonder got cut because of the complaints, or did they get cut short for budget reasons? It's kind of interesting because someone clearly had an appetite for these types of shows, because fast forward some 25, 30, 35 years later, there are a lot of shows that have come and gone that more recently that have these kind of darker tones and subject matter. All right, so in The Walls of Jericho, our heroic foursome of Dr. Harrison Blackwood, Dr. Suzanne McCullough, Norton Drake, and Lieutenant Colonel Paul Ironhorse are still at the safe house where they were set up in the first episode, and Ironhorse thinks that, they might be seeing some positive results over how quiet it has been since they stopped those ships from taking off. Blackwood is particularly cautious. He thinks that if they give up now, the Mortaxans will be able to basically start up their plans again, and it could spell doom for everyone. Elsewhere, a sheriff answers a call from a farmer who has had all of his cattle massacred and drained of their blood. And the tanker is driving down the road with a trio of weirdos, and the truck is, well, bleeding. Well, more accurately, it's full of blood, and when it sloshes around, it spills out onto the road. Now, the blood is being used to help slow the deterioration of the aliens' human suits. The three advocates, as they're called, leading this invasion, are becoming very impatient because they've become too weak due to radiation poisoning to now shed these human skins and be able to survive. So they've got radiation poisoning, they've got heightened body temperature, they've got all sorts of issues going on. Now, meanwhile, McCullough has figured out that the aliens are basically able to take over the bodies of humans by way of something on the similar kind of idea as osmosis. Their cells go into the bloodstream and basically figure out a way to communicate with the human cells. And eventually, not only are they able to basically kill those cells and take over the bodies of the people, but they are also retaining the thoughts and memories of the hosts. What they're not able to replicate are basically the emotions. Now, there's another ability that the aliens have. Blackwood has a theory over why people have a lot of missing memories after they come into contact with aliens. And he thinks that aliens have figured out a way to block out the encounter from people's minds, and that the abductees are also pushing the memory down to basically forget the terrible events that they were put through. And where this whole theory goes, I'm not entirely sure, because it's never really brought up again in this episode, and I don't know if it's brought in later on down the series, but it does seem to be a halfway decent theory, because even their benefactor in all this research and the fight against the aliens, General Wilson, mentions that he was heavily involved with the 1953 incident with the aliens, but he struggles hard to remember any specifics about the events that he saw. And Drake has become a little bit suspicious of the general's knack of suddenly showing up unannounced to check in on their findings. More on that later, because there is actually a reason why he's there. Now, the Mortaxans have ransacked a factory and took over the scientists that worked inside. And basically, the aliens are all working hard to complete their tasks while the advocacy tries to hold on until a cure for that radiation poisoning can be cleared and discovered. Now, our team of good guys have gotten their walking papers from General Wilson, that's the reason why he's there, to talk to them. And he basically thinks that the reports filed by Iron Horse has convinced him that the alien threat is finished. No more alien weirdness going on. No more visible evidence that the aliens are still around. Fine, we're done. We're canceling the whole thing, and we're heading home, basically. Now, while they are starting to pack up, Drake gets a report showing various police reports of the recent strange events with the dead cattle, missing scientists, that factory that they ransacked was a place where plastic products are created, and there's a specific plastic that they are stealing from that place, and that's why the scientists were there. And that is what Blackwood and McCullough realize, that these plastics stolen could be manipulated in a way to create something of a protective suit that could keep the bacteria from harming the aliens. And later, Blackwood, McCullough, and Drake learn about a failed attempt to steal liquid nitrogen. So they know that the Mortaxan ships don't run on rocket fuel, which is mostly made of liquid nitrogen. They just can't seem to figure out what they are using it for. Well, what that purpose is that the liquid nitrogen is to regulate the Mortaxans' body temperatures in these new protective suits that are being built for them. It's when a computer technician comes in to service the computers our trio of scientists are using to solve the alien problem, it's realized that he's using liquid nitrogen as a coolant. McCullough, being a biologist, realizes that the nitrogen is going to counter the effects of the radiation poisoning on the Mortaxin metabolism. Blackwood and Iron Horse go to Jericho Refrigeration, where the aliens are already working on loading up a bunch of canisters of coolant. Blackwood and Iron Horse claim to be from the Department of Health and Safety, and that they're inspectors looking for a specific toxin. Now, Blackwood finds high levels of radiation in one of the workers. Levels so high, in fact, that guy should be dead. And before they can really do much more with that information, they witness an angry wife who believes one of the workers is cheating on her, when that's not really the case. He's been working pretty much 3 days straight, and that's all he says back is, "I've been working." Now, Iron Horse convinces the general to let them put a tracking device on a truck to find out where that nitrogen is going. And they are nearly caught, but are able to not only escape, but also make sure that the general sees what it is that happens after one of the aliens dies and turns into a pile of goo. Our heroes are able to unveil the plot is still happening, but it doesn't account for the hundreds and hundreds of tanks of coolants that have already been delivered to the alien hideout that serves as more than enough to see the invasion all the way through to completion. So let's talk about the 3 things I like about this 3rd episode of War of the Worlds, the Walls of Jericho. Now, while I did generally like the first 2-part episode and found it to be an interesting premise, and back when the show was brand new, the 11 and 12-year-old me definitely found the show to be kind of terrifying, I am also not going to pretend that this show is particularly great. It's a tiny bit dated. It's maybe not really great fodder for a serialized episodic television show. So what I'm going to do is find 3 things that I kind of had fun with that makes this series those exact things. A little dated, not particularly great, and not exactly great fodder for a television series. How's about that for turning things on its head? First up, let's talk about that dated nature of the show. The character of Dr. Harrison Blackwood, played by Jared Martin, is kind of set up and directed and developed to basically act like a scientific hero of the 1950s sci-fi movies. In a lot of ways, he's set up to basically act and kind of look like Gene Barry, who played the heroic Dr. Clayton Forrester in the 1953 movie. There's this low, booming voice that comes out of his mouth, but here's the thing. It all sounds and looks like it's done by way of ADR. Now, ADR stands for Additional Dialogue Recording. This is done when capturing clean audio isn't always possible, or if there is off-screen dialogue that needs to be added to either punch up a scene or fill out a scene or what have you. It's actually a very common movie thing. There aren't many movies that don't require it, usually all done in post-production. But when you have a character whose entire dialogue seems to be done in ADR, it begins to look bad, low budget. It looks like bad, low-budget overdubbing, and that becomes kind of distracting. You wouldn't expect a big-budget modern movie or TV show to require entire ADR work for a single actor, unless there's a reason why the voice needs to be different than what the actor is able to provide. So with that, it starts to look a little cheap, and you kind of begin to make a game out of trying to see if what you're hearing matches what you're seeing. Does this sound like a negative? Sure. But the game starts to become kind of fun after a while. In fact, I think that most of the characters are ADR'd on this show. So when you have like that booming voice of Blackwood going up against the overly militaristic Lieutenant Colonel Iron Horse, played by Richard Chavez, spouting these kind of hard-ass action movie hero quips and lines, it starts to make you feel like you're watching something that isn't made in the 80s for contemporary audiences, but something that was made right after the 1953 movie, specifically for audiences of that era, and it actually starts to become kind of special in a bad movie sort of way. Second, when you have multiple people being ADR'd often, oh boy, does the overacting start to kick in. I think of the show, at least in this episode, to be very badly directed. There are ways that one actor in particular delivers his lines versus how he's basically shown on screen that makes this look something like Ed Wood directed it. I'm talking about the Norton Drake character played by Philip Aiken. Now, Aiken has a long and storied career. He even has done Shakespeare. He was a co-founder and the artistic director of a Canadian theater company called the Obsidian Theater that was geared towards black actors. And this guy isn't a bad actor. And however, in this, whoa, is he hammy. He's almost coming off like he's not taking this seriously at all. He's transitioning between having a Caribbean accent of some kind and having no accent at all. It was originally set up that Drake was to be from either Haiti or from Jamaica. And I believe Philip Aiken is part Jamaican himself. I think he's Jamaican Canadian. But and that was eventually dropped as far as a character trait later on down the series. But it's so uneven in here. But it's kind of great too. If you watch the War of the Worlds series, you should watch it with the same expectations of a kind of bad sequel made hot on the heels of the original film's success. Aiken kind of embodies this with these stilted line deliveries. It's definitely the type of show that reminds you of your love of these types of cheesy and silly sci-fi alien movies that was rampant during the 50s, but made in the 80s. I don't know if that was the production crew's intention when directing this episode or how they created the series and how Aiken specifically was directed or not, but these scenes with the aliens all seem kind of serious and dangerous. But then we go over to our heroes and they don't feel like at all that they are in the same plot. They just don't seem to be taking things very seriously. It's not good, but it's fun. You just kind of start to chuckle to yourself and resign yourself to the fact that you aren't watching a very good show, and it's just kind of silly fun that keeps you coming back. Thirdly, our aliens in this are kind of stupid. This ultimately makes it hard to see how they got 43 episodes out of this premise. The Mortaxans are quite easily derailed in their plans by a lot of things, and nothing seems to be at the level of what their capabilities are. First, the trio of aliens that run everything are really full of themselves. This is the advocacy. They seem to be perpetually victimized by their own hubris. They constantly refer to the other aliens as lesser, but they continually send them out to do really important stuff. Shouldn't maybe they do something since they are so high and mighty? And they're really relying on lesser beings or lesser, classes of their species to do these things. I don't know. But second, basically what I think might just be some random generic Dodge sedan full of two scientists, an old general, and a guy who just wants to be done with the whole alien hunting thing, are able to stop a pretty major plot for these aliens. Granted, they still got all the nitrogen they really needed, but the good guys are so easily able to stop an alien plot to get the last canisters of nitrogen that they blew up the tracking device that they intended on using to get back to the aliens' hideout. A lot of aliens die pretty easily even after telling someone their bullets won't work. So how is there still an invasion force? I mean, they are pretty easily getting mowed down. So do they multiply if they get wet? All this leads to plots and plans that don't seem to make much sense on how they got all these episodes. So here's my advice. If you watch the show, think about it, watching this as if you're, the aliens are like Wile E. Coyote. They have all these well-laid plans, but they easily get foiled at every turn. Again, I started to have a lot of fun watching this episode because it does feel like, again, something from a long time ago where the bad guys are these mustache-twirling villains and they're almost easily defeated just because of hubris. It's quaint in that way. And for me, that's kind of fun. But I'm not so sure that it makes for great television week in and week out. And I'm kind of teasing the show a little bit, and it's still not a bad watch per se. If nothing else, it reminds me of those early days of syndicated TV. Shows like this, or Friday the 13th, or Freddy's Nightmares, or hell, even Star Trek The Next Generation, helped change the landscape of TV by letting things be aired via syndication instead of trapping networks into trying to produce these types of shows. And, like this one in particular, that kind of deal with pretty heady or dark plots. It reaches for quality, not necessarily through a big budget, but through some kind of story element. And in a sort of way, it shares that with classic Doctor Who. However, it is not very well remembered, and I can kind of see why. This is a mini-series at best that's drug out over 43 episodes, and that's going to be rough for a lot of people. Still, I did enjoy this show, even while my 3 likes were almost like roasting the episode for being this kind of odd mix of 80s darkness and 50s camp. But maybe more than anything, I wanted to kind of cover some of this series because of the nostalgia I had of remember seeing some of these really kind of scary and dark plots play out. But that said, it may be a while before we revisit the War of the Worlds TV show. That wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday afternoon at filmseizure.com. Don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Mastodon. And subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieenema.com, to read new articles every Friday morning. Next time, we go visit Mr. Rod Serling with the first episode of Night Gallery. Until next week, stay spooky.